Welcome Rick Saines, who heads the North America Climate Change and Environmental Markets Practice here at Baker McKenzie, and who is our host today in this lovely space. Rick is widely published and globally recognized as a leading climate change lawyer, and what his official title does not divulge is his extraordinary service to climate leadership. In addition to being a very long-standing advisor to the Global Adaptation Index, Rick was a founding member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Climate Change and is on the board of the International Emission Trading Association, which is having an incredibly busy year leading up to COP. He has graciously welcomed ND Gain back for a second year to share insights on corporate climate adaptation. Rick?
I'm hiring you, Joyce. That's the bottom line. I need you everywhere I go. Welcome, everyone. This is an exciting week. We did this last year as well, and it's a great opportunity. It's a great moment for all of us to convene and to spend a bit of time together, focused on where we are in the journey. This week has a different feel to it. The Pope, and let's not forget, this is ND Gain, Notre Dame Gain event here. So, with the Pope being here, and we all have different, probably, expectations or thoughts about what the Pope will say to Congress. I have my wish list. It's just very exciting, and we can feel there's certain, seismic shifts occurring. So let's see what happens this week. This is a great opportunity in particular because, as I understand it, of the 100 or so events this week, this is one of 3 that's centered on resiliency and adaptation. So we're very honored, Joyce and ND Gain, to have the opportunity to host this event. We thank you for your continued relationship with us. We get more out of it than we give to it, trust us. Okay, so I just want to say a few things about the journey where we are. This is an adaptation-centered event, but I think we'd all be remiss if we didn't recognize, first and foremost, that we need aggressive mitigation. And there is a reason that 97 out of the 100 events are focused on mitigation. It's probably the ratio needs to be shifted, clearly. But without aggressive mitigation, the adaptation costs and frankly, the feasibility of being able to do it become much more challenging. So this is not an either-or issue. We've crossed over that sort of thinking. We're into the and thinking, and we need to think away from silos into systems. And we're doing that. It's about figuring out how you integrate mitigation and resiliency in a thoughtful way that allows for continued economic growth and preservation of livelihoods. These are not small undertakings. But in the journey, it's also really, I think, important because it's such a, overwhelming, issue. I know personally I get sort of downtrodden from time to time thinking about all the stuff that has to get done. And it's really important to celebrate success because we need to remind ourselves that there are examples of success. And those examples can lead to best practice sharing, encouragement for others, and so forth. And that's kind of what we're here today to do. And we need to also recognize the role of institutions that are really helping to enable success. And ND Gain is a great example of that. A former president of ours said, "This is hard." He also said, "You can't manage what you don't measure." Those were the 2 things I took away from all the things he said. But that's true. It's hard to manage what you don't measure. And ND Gain has really done some thought leadership on getting that sort of out there and figuring out how you go about measuring. What are the metrics? How are we thinking about success? How do we define success? And there's a continuing process with ND Gain. But that's really critical. It's really important for us to be able to hold ourselves accountable on the journey so that we know what we're doing. We know if we're making progress towards our shared objective. So thank you, Endigain, for your leadership and your continued efforts to push this and figure this out in that regard. Okay, so this is an awards ceremony at its heart as well, and this is part of sharing the success. And I don't know, how many people saw the Emmys the other night? Yeah? So I really am tempted to eat this because I know the winners, but I won't tell them to you. Jimmy Kimmel came out and he literally ate the card and then made it seem like he was just randomly selecting who the winner was for one of the events. Not going to do that. But I do want to congratulate the winners today on their leadership. And, you know, it's more than just patting ourselves on the back. This is an opportunity to raise awareness and, really importantly, to demonstrate sort of thought leadership and innovation and share best practices as a way to encourage others to sort of adopt similar practices or think about their own practices in a way that can advance the common solution. So without further ado, let me turn it back over to Joyce. Thank you, Joyce. And I look forward to the session. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Rick. And, you know, I think Rick's point about there being a lot of events is really important, right? It's been a really remarkable year for big climate events. This spring, the Disaster Resilience Community marked 25 years in Sendai and created the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And of course, this week, the Sustainable Development Goals Summit is taking place here in New York City. And Paris, COP21, the climate talks that are expected to turn in not only an international agreement on greenhouse gas reduction finally, but also a real roar for adaptation is expected to come out of Paris. And earlier this year, you know, the Pope issued an urgent appeal to fight climate change, and he helped to really firmly characterize climate change as a humanitarian issue, which gave credence to this adaptation question. Perhaps this great showing today actually suggests that you did think the University of Notre Dame was going to present you with the Pope in his Pope mobile as he goes down the street, but he's actually, I think, still in DC waiting to present to Congress, and will be here at the General Assembly on Friday. So we're missing him sorely. I think perhaps, though, this packed room is really a reflection of the prevailing interest for more corporate adaptation action. And let me see if we can determine just a bit more about you in the audience here. Can I have a show of hands about how many of you would call yourself a corporate leader? Okay, about a quarter of you. And how many would you say are nonprofit? All right, a little more, maybe a third. And then what about the government sector? Even another quarter. Okay, great. Well, welcome, all of you. And one last question. How many would consider yourself an adaptation professional in some fashion? Excellent, about half the room. Well, one outcome of today is that all of you will see elements of your work as related to climate adaptation, I hope, and that another outcome is that you will have some real stories of adaptation solutions, actions, collaborations, and innovations. And those actions are important as the world has begun to show what happens when the climate changes. I mean, here we are at the 10-year anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, and 3 years have now passed since Superstorm Sandy really slammed into New York and New Jersey. This area here would have been in a very different place a few years ago. Right now, of course, California is the place that we worry about because a really deep drought is biting across the state, and it's already caused over $2.2 billion in damages. And an area equivalent to more than a quarter of the entire state of New York is currently or has been on fire in the upper Northwest in the forest fires. So extreme weather events like bigger, more destructive hurricanes, hotter and longer droughts, record-breaking wildfires, and biblical floods are really quite something to handle. And they're not simply the domain of just the United States. You know, indeed, NDA scientists have calculated that people living in least developed countries have 10 times more chance of being impacted by a climate disaster than those in wealthy countries each year. So last year, in fact, the world mourned the loss of over 8,000 souls due to climate change. And these events, climate events, totaled in economic damage over $90 billion. As people, governments, and corporations are increasingly impacted by droughts, superstorms, civil conflicts, and other disruptions caused by climate change, the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index identifies critical adaptation needs and opportunities. We promote adaptation by identifying the places most vulnerable to changing climate, and as we'll talk about more today, we identify real-world solutions that could prevent these damages from becoming disasters. NDGAIN focuses on vulnerability to climate shocks and stresses, and very uniquely, the readiness to accept private and public sector investment in adaptation in order to inform supply chains, capital projects, community engagements, and regulations. So NDGAIN's free and open source country index encompasses 20 years of data for 180 countries across 46 sectors. And the index's easy-to-use analytic and visualization tools provide dozens of answers to value chain questions. NDGAIN Country Index also shows that it will take more than 100 years for lower-income countries to catch up to the level of resilience of OECD countries. This information is galvanizing NDGAIN to begin our next era, which is a focus on urban assessment of resilience so that we can provide similar tools to leaders looking for city-related information. So today, NDGAIN is pleased to award our 2015 Corporate Adaptation Prize in support of our mission to enhance the world's understanding about the need to adapt and to inform public and private investments in vulnerable communities. That's why we are honoring two remarkable projects that are leading the way for climate adaptation, implementing real-life solutions in communities. Submissions for this prize were received representing projects in over 30 countries and more than 20 topics, from forestry, water and food, to energy, infrastructure, and health. Projects were evaluated on their measurable adaptation progress, scalability, market impact, and partnerships. And we have a very special thanks today to our 10 judges, 3 or 4 of whom are here today. Chris Walker, are you here from World Business Council? He must be on his way. In any case, Chris Walker, the Director of North America for World Business Council for Sustainable Development, Carolyn Wu, the President of Catholic Relief Services, and several other judges, along with people you're here from on our panel, Nick Shufro with PwC, Aman Singh at Edelman, and Peter Mulvaney with West Monroe Partners. So you may wonder, who are these other people sitting on the panel? Well, it is my pleasure to announce the 2015 NDGAIN Corporate Adaptation Prize winners. First, Renske with DADTCO, a small company in Holland. DADTCO has developed a Cassava starch operation that's mobile, and it allows this edible root to be processed close to smallholder farmers instead of transporting this highly perishable crop over long distances to a central factory. Now, this technology really unlocks the opportunity for cassava, which is a major food crop in much of Africa, to replace expensive imported cereals like rice and wheat, and boost the national economy. And it may be, in fact, the first craft beer to be called climate adaptive. So we're very pleased that DADTCO has won this year's prize. And our next prize goes to engineering leader AECOM and technology giant IBM for developing a disaster resilience scorecard to help communities understand, communicate, and put into effect actions that reduce disaster risk and accelerate recovery from disasters. The scorecard supports the United Nations efforts to manage and reduce disasters by bringing together expertise and resources from the public and private sectors. So the NDGAIN Prize winners demonstrate that scalable, corporate-driven climate adaptation is happening around the world. And NDGAIN hopes that the stunning examples that DADTCO, IBM, and AECOM represent will inspire leaders from all sectors to galvanize initiatives that save lives and improve livelihoods in the face of the global shift of climate change. I'm going to turn it over now to our panel to speak a little bit further about corporate climate adaptation and the innovations that are coming out of emerging economies from both large corporations and small. And rather than taking precious time from the panel, I'm going to ask that you read their brief bios on the back instead of reciting them to you now. My first question for the panel is for Renske, Dale, and Peter. I'd like you to each explain your award-winning work and how you're helping the most vulnerable in this project. What is innovative about what you are doing? Who are your partners, and how are you scaling your impact? Renske, can we start with you?
We are DADTCO, and we are a cassava processing company. We are the first one actually who processes a food-grade product at the moment. Cassava is a major starchy food crop in Africa, and it provides the largest calorie intake in Africa as well for all people there. It's actually pronounced or announced as the Rumbo food crop by scientific journals because it's drought resistant, it's easy to grow, and it has very low it needs very low input. And because of its perishability, it has not been the crop has not been able yet to commercialize. So it's only usually now maize and rice and wheat, but as starch sources. But that's because cassava is within 24 hours when you harvest it, you have to process it. And we as DADTCO have invented the mobile starch processing plant. I was talking about cassava, that it's about the advantages of the crop, and I think it's a root crop. I don't know even if many people know it. In cassava, in Africa, everybody knows it, and it's eaten everywhere because of its advantages. But the disadvantage is when after harvesting, you have to, within 24 hours, you have to process it. And DADTCO has now invented a mobile processing unit that goes close to the farmer and can, within the same day, it is possible to process it now to an intermediate product. That intermediate product, it has a long shelf life and can now be used for different industries, like food industry, the beverage industry. And so we are actually bridging that gap from millions of farmers in Africa that have little or no market for their produce because they're very far away and the infrastructure is so bad in Africa, and the food industry that wants starch. So starch is used in a lot of things. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's all imported in Africa. Africa has millions of farmers, but it's importing all their cereals. And so we are bridging that gap between farmers and that industry. And we have proven our business model already in Mozambique. We sell to S&D Miller, which is one of the largest breweries in the world. And they do 20 million bottles of cassava-based beer per year. And we have been able already to reach 8,000 farmers and providing them a stable income every year. So the most innovative about our technology is that we are close to the farm, so we are able to go close to the remote areas. And also we invented a methodology to remove the cyanide, which is still in there. That's also a disadvantage of cassava, but we have been able to remove that together with Wageningen University. It's an agricultural university in the Netherlands, and the Rockefeller Foundation has also rewarded us as that we are reducing the waste. So it's root crops has been like 40% is wasted because of its perishability, but because of our technology, it's only 5% waste. So we have been able to really reduce that. I think that's great.
Thank you so much. Okay. So I think for our panelists, please blow into the mic a little bit to make it live so it knows that you're up here. And Dale, I'm going to turn to you and ask you to share a little bit more about your award-winning work.
Great. Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me well now. Good. Thank you for being here. It's a real pleasure and honor to accept this on behalf of AECOM. We have worked in the climate adaptation and engineering area for many, many years. So as really the world's largest design engineering firm, we believe we had a unique insight in looking at the risk from natural disasters in particular. And following a workshop that Peter and I participated in with the city and county of San Francisco, where we brought together a variety of different departments, we discovered that there was a real need for a tool to evaluate the degree of preparedness in response to a natural disaster. Now, the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction had created a tool called the 10 Essentials, which provided us a framework to consider. The 10 Essentials were not perfect by any stretch, but they did provide some signposts and a parameter for us to develop a quantitative scorecard, as we call it, with 81 different questions to help a city really come together across many different departments to evaluate the preparedness. In the workshop that I referenced, we actually had public and private sector working together to talk about resilience. And we saw that there was a need for a tool to guide this discussion, to create a process to work between the private and the public sector, and to bring different departments together within a city as well, which is a very complex organization. And so with that in mind, working with Peter and IBM, we created this quantitative tool that's now been applied in 8 different languages, probably at least 3 dozen applications, mostly outside of North America, to help cities, municipalities evaluate their degree of preparedness and develop an action plan for a 1, 3, 5-year kind of horizon. Some of those decisions that are needed don't require capital, but require political courage. But it helps to clarify those items, and it really becomes a tool for more integration, if you will, between the public and the private sector.
Great. Peter, you want to add some things, please?
Surely, and again, on behalf of IBM, thank you very much indeed for recognising the work we've done with this award. It's a real honour. Especially as I didn't even know that the scorecard had been entered for the competition, and the first I heard about it was when Dale contacted me and said, "We've won."
That's the best kind of award ever.
So it's all good. Some thoughts that would help kind of frame this. Firstly, the notion of disaster resilience. Resilience is in danger of becoming a general theory of everything. You hear people talking about economic resilience, cultural resilience, social resilience, environmental resilience, disaster resilience. We are focused very specifically on disaster resilience and on those other things to the extent that they influence disaster resilience. And a good example of that would be take the notion of ecosystem services, environmental resilience. If you reduce the level of forestation on hillsides above a town, which is you can think of as a chronic stress, you're increasing the risk of flash floods, which you can think of as an acute stress or a disaster. So there's an interplay between them, and we're interested in the extent to which that interplay actually exists. The second point about the scorecard, I think, is that it's been put together, and this is one of the reasons why we like the 10 Essentials. You can think of a city as a system of systems. So it's made up of lots and lots of different systems. Some of them are physical, transportation, energy, communications, water, etc., etc. Some of them are social, around different churches, social clubs, that kind of thing. You've got a huge spectrum, and if you're going to make a city more resilient, you've got to be able to enable action across the full spread of that system of systems. And that's what the scorecard is trying to do. The third thing is resilience is a problem that spans multiple timescales, ranging from things like changing land use and planning, zoning and building codes, which is only going to take effect over multiple years, maybe a decadal scale, that kind of thing. You can't suddenly tell the city of New York to go somewhere else, or the city of New Orleans to go somewhere else. Although that was a thought that was raised, I think, after Katrina. It takes some number of years at least to influence that. Whereas there are some things that you want to be doing kind of right now, in terms of warning systems, in terms of evacuating people, and so on. You've got that entire spread of timescales from decadal and multi-decadal right down to minute by minute. So disaster resilience spans all of that, and that goes immediately to the kind of information you need to support decisions at which timescale to comprise the total solution to resilience. So that's what we tried to do with the scorecard. As we were writing it, we had the thought that, oh my God, this thing's going to be massive. But then we thought, well, okay, so it's a complex problem. Let's keep going. So then at least we can say we've kind of touched the sides. And the result is the scorecard that we have today, as holistic as we can make it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. So with these excellent examples that are award-winning, I'd like Peter, Nick, and Aman to share with us what you know of as some of the best climate adaptation happening driven by the corporate sector. And Aman, I'll turn to you first.
Thank you. Do I need to hold the mic up? Am I loud enough in the back? Okay. Awesome, thank you. I am a loudspeaker anyway, so if I'm too loud, just raise your hand. But thank you all for showing up. I thought it was really early. I got on a train at 6:20 out of Jersey, and I was thinking, oh my God, some people better show up. So thank you, and thank you to Joyce for including me in the panel. It's been a pretty good process in learning about all the contenders who submitted entries, and congratulations to the winners. So I've been in the sector from a media perspective my entire life. I'm now at Edelman. It's my first time not reporting on these topics, so a lot of respect gained in the 1 year working sort of on the back end of things and getting into the nitty-gritty of climate adaptation from a corporate perspective. So a lot of what I'm going to say is going to come with a hint of sort of respect. Starting to know some of these challenges, which you don't really get to know as a journalist. So just wanted to put that out there. So a couple of examples. One, Unilever came out with their human rights report earlier this year talking about their human rights risks. They're using a framework, no surprise, but they are one of very few companies who put out a piece of disclosure that actually tries to map human rights risk to their business and their supply chain, which, as any of you can guess, is huge. We were part of the team that worked with them on putting that report together, and the lessons learned in those 6 to 7 months are immense about climate adaptation and how it crosses over boundaries and cultures and also issues. So for me, the biggest highlight of the Pope coming to the US is that he's actually being able to connect climate change, which is wonky and political, and a lot of people don't want to touch it, to poverty and everyday life and habits and behavior. And that's what that report did in many ways for Unilever. It helped them understand all the loopholes, all the pieces they need to work on, and also even better to connect the dots from a broader corporate perspective. So, for example, in Africa, their challenges around human rights and climate change are very closely knit together because it's based on land rights and availability and resources and income. Another example, Mars. How many of you have eaten a piece of Mars candy in your lifetime? Most of us, right? How many of you buy Mars pet food for your pets? So believe it or not, I didn't know this either until I started working with them. That is their biggest revenue generating division. It's their pet food. So a lot of their climate adaptation challenges come from the pet food area. So for example, the challenges are all about from tuna fishing and the fisheries and their lifestyle and what they're doing with oceans and their livelihoods to changing consumer behavior, because as consumers and pet owners, they want the best cut of the tuna, they want the best cut of the steak, and that's not sustainable, and it's not going to be available in a few years. Tuna has gone down 75% from an availability perspective. So for Mars, it's two ends of the spectrum. We were having this conversation with Peter earlier today about how marketing and business development sometimes comes together and they're talking the same language, but they just don't know it. And that's what's happening at Mars. They're starting to connect the dots, and it is climate adaptation, but it's so much more. It's product, it's consumer behavior, and it's actually looking across the systems 20 years ahead to understand not only how they will be in business, but that we actually all have a sustainable lifestyle. So I'll stop there.
That's great. Thank you, Aman. How about you, Peter Mulvaney? Any thoughts about the competitive advantage and corporate examples of adaptation?
Well, sure. First off, I'd like to play off of Joyce's opening question marks. And first, you can hear me back there? Yes. So if you could raise your hands if you do work for a corporation, right? So we have these segmentations, but I think everybody here probably has a job. And I would suggest that the best projects and examples will come from you guys, and I would challenge you all to think about how you could, as you learn more about adaptation, how you can bring that to your companies and create your own adaptation project. And I think those will be the best ones to talk about in the future. An example that I've seen, there are many, especially in the water space, where companies such as Strauss, Levi Strauss is working with their supply chain, or Miller Coors is working with their supply chain to reduce water in their supply chain, the farming, the moving to drip irrigation, And there's a tremendous movement to promote efficiency, create resilience in their supply chain, and improve the performance of their products. And so there are just so many to talk about with respect to saving water. But actually, I think I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, excellent. How about you, Nick?
So good morning. Thank you for having us.
So glad you're here.
So I work on the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and a new initiative called the ARISE Initiative, which is focused on making investments disaster risk sensitive. And through the last year, I've had an opportunity to visit a couple of different countries and visit some different projects that are going on. And I actually recused myself from scoring the AECOM IBM proposal because I've worked with them. But one of the first examples that I'd really like to give is an example of, we did a workshop with the Scorecard in Bandung, Indonesia, which is the second or third largest city in Indonesia. It's looking to be competitive with Jakarta, very large metropolitan area. Getting from one city to the next took 4 hours on the way down and about 9 hours on the way back because of traffic. They've got some real resiliency issues, and they've got some real risks, ranging from flooding to volcanic eruptions to other types of risks. And what really, the session that I attended was with government sector, so they tend to run these with government participants, then private sector, then NGOs, and then mix it up a little bit. The session I was in, which really helped me to understand the benefit of this scorecard, was the mayor, who's very progressive for the city, got up at the beginning and said, I have representatives from 16 different agencies in the room. There are about 75 people, and many of you have never met or have never worked with others, and you might not even know what other agencies do, what types of information are out there. And so I'd like you to spend the next 2 days getting to know each other and starting to build these relationships, because at the end of the day, when there is an event, when there is a disaster that strikes, when we need to adapt to a changing environment, you need to be able to trust the people you're working with. And I don't really, as a mayor, I don't really care what the score is going to be. He said, I know that many of you will try and make me look good by giving us an inflated score. That's not the purpose of today and tomorrow. The purpose of these 2-day workshops is really to understand where we are, and more importantly, to come up with a plan to address where we have gaps and how we can improve our resiliency, because the population depends on it, the city depends on it. It's really important to do. So to me, I commend both of you for working on this scorecard. It's really been, from that perspective, it was great to see the agencies come together. A couple of other little other examples. How many people have heard of the Waffle House?
Yeah.
So the Waffle House is predominant. It's like an IHOP, International House of Pancakes. It's predominantly a Southeast United States restaurant, and they're preparing for disasters, and their adaptation measures are, when they hear there's there's a hurricane coming through, they actually fly people into the potentially impacted region. So their whole management team comes in, and they fly additional staff in, and they prepare by bringing people in with the idea that after the curfew is lifted, after the storm has passed through, the emergency responders, one of the things that they will want is hot coffee and a hot meal. And so they want their restaurants to be open immediately, as soon as they can after storms. So that's one thing that I thought, just a small example, not very capital intensive, but a great example. The final example I'll give is SM Holdings is a mall manufacturer, a mall developer in the Philippines. Very high-end malls. Think of some of the places that you go to in the States. And they actually developed their malls with the idea that in many countries, private sector buildings are the strongest built, and they will be centers of refuge. And so the design criteria requests that the building be built X number of feet above sea level. They will build it up a little higher. And they expect that when a flood hits, when a typhoon comes through in Manila or wherever in the Philippines, they actually expect people, not only their employees, but their customers, to come into the stores and to actually seek refuge in their stores. So that's another example that I think is just great.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, many of these examples that we've shared today really suggest that there's a positive return on investment to resilience and adaptation efforts, that they in fact are having, big time benefit on the bottom line, which I think is a really important message to carry forth today. Nick, you mentioned about the city government, the mayor. I'd like to ask several of you on the panel, whoever would like to respond to this, what do you think the role is of corporations to make sure that future policy is really supportive of adaptation? So in addition to that government regulatory question, is there a role for public-private partnerships in this? And Peter, it looks like you have
Yeah, so we recently did a scorecard exercise for the city of Stamford in Connecticut. It was just a one-day workshop, in fact, using the scorecard as a set of discussion prompts. And one of the features of that workshop that I think worked really well was the fact that it was organised by an organisation called Stamford 2030, which is a business roundtable kind of forum that combines the city government and some of the big businesses, Starwood Hotels, United Rentals, I believe. There's a defence company that's got a big manufacturing plant there, to think collectively about the future of that city. And one of the issues that they're thinking about, obviously, is not just where is the economic activity going to go and how's it going to spread, but the whole issue of disaster resilience, given that they're part of the sort of hurricane track for the east coast of the US. And they were collectively thinking through, okay, so these are the things we need to do. Each business should have anyway some kind of business continuity plan. It'd be a really good idea if their business continuity plans were built on the same assumptions as the city government. And by the way, in most places they aren't, I can guarantee it. So, a business continuity plan would assume that such and such a resource would be available, whereas the city government plan will assume that it's not available, and vice versa. So just as you were saying, as the Mayor of Bandung was saying, for God's sake, just talk to each other. Well, the first thing is actually just to have a dialogue, and IBM now does this. We lost, temporarily anyway, part of our hard disk drive supply for our computer manufacturing as a result of the flooding in Bangkok 4 or 5 years ago. That was the aha moment for us, because even though we could have invested all of the effort to keep our own plant open, if our workforce couldn't get there, we're just as hosed as if we hadn't bothered. And the workforce, obviously, it's down to the city government to enable people to get to work, reboot the economy as rapidly as possible. Said differently, we're in this together. Another organisation that really gets this, and Dale and I have been part of these conversations, is the US military. They're looking very hard at the resilience of military installations from the standpoint that we can't really think about this separately from the communities in which we're based, because all of those installations have civilian workers. If the civilian workers can't get to work, the base doesn't work anyway. So they are very consciously taking a focus not just on the military installation itself, but on the entire community in which it's located. And again, that's an example of how the corporate interest and the public interest are effectively aligned. But what it does need is an almost unprecedented level of discussion and comparison of plans, integration of effort, and sharing of information over and above what is today anyway the norm.
That's great. C2ES, who is here today, really helped to draw the world's attention to this question about what happened in the Thai storms in terms of supply chain, and gave us some really important metrics about the billions of dollars that were lost by global corporations when they couldn't get access to hard drive manufacturers, pigment manufacturers, and others. So that's a really excellent point about sort of adapting beyond the fence line to increase the likelihood that you can continue to operate business as usual in the face of climate changes. Other examples of corporations sort of driving government changes? Yeah, Nick.
So we had a major event last Friday in the city of Boston, which was co-sponsored by the UN RISE Initiative and Willis Reinsurance and also PwC. And the question there was, there's a property developer called Boston Properties that has properties down in New York City, obviously has properties in Boston. And some of their buildings were severely impacted by Sandy and in New York City, and they decided to take some actions in Boston to make their properties more resilient. And having done that, they expected to see some kind of linear relationship between taking action and getting rewarded. And they believed that they should be facing lower premiums and possibly upticks in their ratings from the rating agencies. And much to their dismay, they found out that that was not the case, that the linear relationship doesn't exist. So working with Boston Properties, they co-sponsored this event last week. We brought together the federal government, in terms of the White House Council on Environmental Quality, FEMA. We brought together 4 different states. We brought participants from the insurance industry, reinsurance industry, some NGOs that look at insurance, and we started to work on a really practical basis, trying to identify specific strategies that could be taken. Because when you say there should be a linear relationship between action and reward, well, it turns out the insurance companies can't do certain things because they are subject to what the reinsurers tell them. And then in our fractured system in the United States, the reinsurers and the insurance companies can't do things because there are 50 state regulations, and there are certain things that can't be done without the insurance commissioners from the different states participating. So this dialogue was pretty robust last week, and this is an example where the private sector brought people together and came up with some practical solutions that we'll now look to implement with the 4 states of Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New York.
Excellent, great. Yes, Dale.
No, I would just add to the good comments that have been made that there is really an inexplicable partnership between the public and the private sector in any major municipality. The majority of the investment often is made by the private sector to the city. The idea of synergy together and growing together, recruiting other companies to come in based on your city being more resilient is becoming more real. So there is a partnership. It is developing. The Sendai framework, approved by 187 member states in March, actually has 33 different references to bring the private sector into the climate adaptation resilience discussion. And so I think by working together, we're going to be able to advance much quicker. And the other fact is that so many of the natural disasters are in fact uninsured. 80% of the losses are not insured. And so those losses then fall to the government or they fall to the private sector. So how do we work together to improve our resilience is really, I think, one of the secrets of future success.
That's great. So thinking now about solutions again, tell me about whether you think adaptation requires local solutions, tailor-made to that area, or are there solutions that are in fact applicable around the globe? And Peter, Aman, I'll start with both of you so that you can share any additional thoughts about that and then move to others on the panel.
Yeah, I think it's both, honestly. So there are plenty of things you can do. For example, take the insurance industry as an example. The insurance industry operates on what you might call a model reality. So the notion that they could actually work from empirical data to assess the improvement in a city's resilience over time tends to take a backseat to what their catastrophe models are telling them. So a global change would be enabling, exactly as, this sounds like Nick made a pretty good start on last week, enabling the insurance industry to see that there is an empirical way of doing things as well as a modeled way of doing things. So that would be a global change. The local change is absolutely right. One street at a time, one block at a time, one neighbourhood at a time, one levee at a time, one piece of woodland at a time, and so on and so on. Absolutely. So it's both. It's not either or.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of thoughts to build on that. I agree. It's both based on your business model and your scale. I mean, there's Walmart on one end of the spectrum. They can have global scale by just saying we're only going to work with suppliers who do X, Y, and Z. Right, so that's global, but with local ramifications. Then there's tools like Closedloop Fund, which is basically a financing mechanism to bring municipalities in conversation and get funding from the private sector, because that's sort of the missing gap in a lot of this work. There's no one to finance this stuff. So what Closedloop Fund does is it's brought a lot of the big manufacturing companies together to fund a fund. $100 million, which they will then give out to municipalities to build recycling infrastructure. So it's a small piece of the climate adaptation sector, but it's crucial because they found over 60% of American households still don't have access to recycling. Which sitting in New York is, I don't even understand how that's possible, but it is. And so it's a small piece of it, but it's systemic thinking because the companies are investing in this for the long term because more recycling product will let them package more recycled, will let them use more recycled stuff. So I think that's more local because the municipalities are going to have to roll this out on a local level, and then there's the Walmart sort of big brother attitude.
Very good. Renske, do you have a thought about the local question, given the very local work that you all do?
Yeah, I think that it's true that there are global things that from international level would be good for the local people, but like what we see in Africa, it's so difficult to work also with governments that have other issues like with corruption, and it's to get that certain policy to really to implement it and to have it working for the local people. It's a huge gap to bridge. So I think it's we should have more space also to have to seek to give more. Like for us, we are like a quite small enterprise, but with a very local solution. And yeah, I think maybe that's also a bit what you said, but it's how do we get out those local solutions more? That it's instead of talking with international companies that have already set a certain standard and it's a blueprint and it sounds good like to implement everywhere, but yeah, how do we do that to get more the local solutions up? Because I think the local solutions can actually, in the end, maybe small scale, but they are really making a big difference. So yeah, I think local solutions are very important to make really that difference.
Excellent. So I'm going to turn to the audience in a moment for questions from all of you. But before I do, I want just a quick lightning round for each of the panelists to respond. How do you believe corporate adaptation investment can be increased? What is the crucial element to increasing corporate investment in adaptation? So if each of you could take about 30 seconds to respond to that. And Dale, I'm going to turn to you first.
Good. Great. Well, first of all, I think awareness is important. There's tremendous vulnerability in the supply chain that often is not measured or prepared for, and particularly in response to a natural disaster. So I think we are improving awareness. We're seeing business continuity plans that are becoming more robust in consideration of disaster events. We're also seeing a lot more collaboration between cities. The UN ISDR is a program called Making My City Resilient. Over 2,600 world cities have signed up for that agreement to collaborate and cooperate with one another. The Rockefeller Foundation also has created a program called the RC100, tremendous program to fund cities up to $1 million to create a chief resiliency officer and a resiliency plan. So that is really beginning to raise awareness and get us away from the argument, is there climate change or not? The reality is we have many more natural disasters now than we had 30 years ago. And so we need to respond and prepare and make our cities more resilient.
Excellent. Peter Mulvaney.
Sure. I had similar thoughts in that opening the dialogue, for corporations to open the dialogue, to listen to more voices, so to increase the pool of partnerships which they're willing to engage in. I think that's the first and key step to creating more resiliency within that corporation.
Renske?
I think an enabling environment from governments for businesses to roll out their solutions. Like in Nigeria, for example, there's a 10% degree that 10% of all the wheat should be substituted by cassava flour, which is really good. But if it's not followed up, and that is what is happening, then industry stands still. So that's also a big role for governments to play.
Excellent. Nick, increasing investments from corporates in adaptation.
So a tactical project that we're working on is getting people to use the same terms and to understand that even if they have different terms, they're really the same. So we have a project with green infrastructure or natural coastal infrastructure. Part of the reason that there is no visibility is because these projects are fragmented. Everybody has a different term. Is it green-gray? Is it hybrid? Is it natural coastal infrastructure? So getting a taxonomy together so we can start saying this is the size of the market. These are the number of projects that are out there. Insurance companies, you should be paying attention. Financiers, you should be paying attention because this is something that's really happening. So getting people to speak the same language and just do away with some of the unnecessary differences.
Excellent. Aman?
Two things. One, picking up on the language question, get the unlikely people together for more constructive dialogue. So not just the environmental management people or the people who spit out the report every year. It's the sales people, the biz dev people, the marketing people, the R&D people, maybe someone who runs your office in Africa. Get those people in a dialogue so we can actually start to understand all the ramifications. That's one. And two, I have a dear friend here from EDF in the audience, find her after this. They have a great fellowship. It's called the Climate Course Fellows. You guys need brain power for free. No, it's not free. But it's interns, it's MBA students. They will come to your office. They'll work with you for 10 weeks and they'll give you the research and a starting point to get some of this going without you spending hours and a lot more money on it. So use them.
And Peter.
In a nutshell, ROI. If I can make money as a corporation in some way, or save money in some way, or show others how to make money or save money in some way from being more resilient, we're going to do it. It's about creating the financial preconditions that makes resilience a worthwhile investment. And there's a gazillion ways to do that, whether you're talking about investing in better processing of cassava starch because it becomes worth the farmer's while to do it, or whether you're talking about IBM or AECOM investing in civil infrastructure or information technology or whatever it might be. There's a million ways to do it. But at the end of the day, it comes down to ROI. Make it financially worth doing. Change the rules of the financial game such that resilience is an investment on a par with anything else.